Welcome to Podcast of the Church. My name is Reed Huberman, and as always, I am with my pastor, Frank Ramstor, and then I've got C. Elliott Johnston next to him, and then Jesse Paul. These guys are with us today, and we're going to be talking about human sexuality. I believe it's a relevant topic, not only because we're coming up with new versions of it consistently in the culture, but also it's important because there is only one human sexuality. All of us around the table believe that. We don't have to call it biblical sexuality because we believe that what the Bible describes is the only kind of sexuality, and everything else is an addition or a perversion to that. So we're going to do that via the context of a conversation that just recently took place within a kind of large Christian circle. Preston Sprinkle had a conversation with a guy named Jared Moore. Now, Preston Sprinkle kind of has a pretty large outreach, and some of you will be familiar with who he is. And then most people, I would say, probably don't know Jared Moore, but he's a PhD in systematic theology, just wrote a book called Lust of the Flesh, and he's a pastor in Crossville. He was going to join us actually today, but because of various technical issues, he wasn't able to do that. But maybe in the future, even outside of this context, I think it might be good to kind of have the conversation with him. But we're going to kind of give our reflection on this conversation because ultimately, Preston and Jared's conversation was titled, "Why is Preston Sprinkle a heretic?" based upon his views of human sexuality. So Jared believed that he is, and Preston obviously was defending himself, thinking that he was not. Now, I would just say the general impression around the table was that conversation between these two men was something that left us with a little bit of consternation, with a little bit of frustration, simply because of a myriad of different issues, which we'll get into here in this podcast. And the ultimate goal here today for us guys is to talk about the things that we felt like were beneficial, maybe the things that could be improved upon, but also try to provide some kind of redemptive takeaways, at least whatever additions we can provide to the conversation, because this is a huge and important conversation to have, especially now, and we'll get into why. Before we do that, let's just get general impressions around the table of what you guys felt like the conversation kind of left you with, not necessarily digging into the weeds, but what was your general impression walking away from the conversation? So we'll start with you, Jesse.
Yeah, so before we kind of dig into the content of the conversation, my impression was, I always say there's two ditches. There's a ditch on both sides of the road. Mm-hmm. You can go too far or not go far enough. This is applicable to a million different things, but in this camp with Dr. Moore, he represents the kind of pseudo-legalistic, fundamentalist-ish, I want to be careful with those terms, but definitely leans that way. Arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, then over with Preston Sprinkle, you have guys that are colloquially known as Big Eva. A lot of other people call it the evangelical industrial complex, that constantly are broadening the Overton window and shifting the sort of standard to the left towards progressivism. And so the fundamentalist ties typically are just, it doesn't take discernment to take every single issue and have a hard line stance and just be as conservative and just, it's easy, I guess. I mean, if you don't touch anything, you're not going to, if you don't get within a mile of fire, you're not going to burn. But there is some nuance that is faithful for the Christian, because there is gray area exists in the world. That's what fundamentalists don't understand. Mm-hmm. And then the guys, to be fair, the guys on the Sprinkle side, the gospel coalition types, the Killers, the Pipers, the Chandlers, etc., in effort to be winsome is a big key word that people critical of the Big Eva movement will constantly point out that when you hear the word winsome, and this is almost always true, it's really a moniker for compromise. Like at what point do you just love the culture so much that you do a bait and switch and then give him Christ? That kind of never happens, right? But then the Jared Moore is going to be the types, just yelling at people on the street corner, right? And what's faithful? Is faithful evangelism between those two, maybe? Between psychopathic street preaching? Not that some street preaching is very faithful. I know a lot of those guys. Yeah. But, the yelling, like, where's the line between, again, to keep building a caricature, the God hates fags over here on the street corner, and the, what exactly do you mean by, what is biblical? What do you really mean by masculine? I just have to unpack. We just have to sit down and unpack what you mean by homosexual. It's like, at some point you're nuancing and splicing everything to death that you can't have a conversation.
Sure. Yeah. By the way, Jordan Peterson calls that an infinite regress, because you can you need to define terms, but you can also define so much that you're actually not getting anywhere.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So I think
it's deconstruction, another term. Yeah.
So for me, we'll get into the content stuff, but that was my general impression. One of frustration and talking over one another, because for people so far on different sides of even how we deal with these issues, in the degree to which it's faithful to meet in the middle, compromise, discern nuance. Like doing none at all isn't helpful, but then nuancing everything also is similarly muddy. So that was my general feel. Consternation is a good adjective for that.
Yeah. So Chris, I thought especially about you in terms of human sexuality, because we've had a lot of conversations online and offline about AI, since that's your field, and there seems to be a new perversion a day as far as AI is concerned, and we've talked about like how much of a threat to like national security and to the media is AI, and it's been my general impression, kind of jokingly but also being sincere, that essentially human beings will do with this technology what they do with most technologies. They'll find a way to turn it into entertainment and find a way to turn it into a way to consume porn. So suffice to say, there's a way in which I just recently came across that people are doing this, that there's actually an app where people are taking a picture, they can do it of random strangers, and then this AI intelligence will strip this person down and then create a nude image of this complete stranger, whoever it is that you have a picture of. So I think the consequences of misunderstanding human sexuality actually carry a large price tag, so it's really important that we get this right. So it's another reason why I wanted to have the conversation. But what was your general takeaway from the conversation?
Yeah, I'd like to find out what that app is. I'm not, obviously.
I think it's called Undressy, literally.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with that. That's I work in this industry and I'm not familiar with that. And I like to, write some pieces on that, revealing that, if that's the case.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to talk more about the AI and how AI is, and I think that there are some specific points of content that we really should address, and that kind of something I resonated with. My feeling coming at this conversation from a place of ignorance about both of them, honestly. I'm familiar with Francis Chan, and you kind of explained that there was a little bit of some relationship between him and
between Preston and Francis.
Yeah. But I'm not. I wasn't familiar with either one of these gentlemen before. I think that my feeling, kind of stepping back and really trying to kind of take a Gestalt view of it, was that. There is just sort of a loss of the understanding, within the construct of deconstruction, right? Like looking at it, theological nitpicking. And I think the thing that I walked away from the conversation feeling was that Jared, I can't remember his last name, Moore, Mr. Moore or Dr. Moore, his approach felt like there was sort of a loss of recognition that we all live under the condemnation of sin. Mm-hmm. So that sin is a universal application to our nature. It is a fallenness that we live under, and heresy is something that we can cast on everyone if we're actually operating off of his rule set. And so I felt like the conversation was generally fairly cordial. They were trying to move through the issues as well as they could, but I didn't really walk away feeling like, oh, this is something I felt enriched by. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, so Pastor, we've actually talked a good bit about this, and now you weren't really familiar. You've heard the name of Preston Sprinkle, but you weren't really familiar with Jared before.
Yeah.
So what I think is going to be interesting from the conversations that we've had is that I think there will be slight differences or just slight clarification even between us. And I also want to just clearly state that the only person, I've worked very hard, the only person that can cancel me in this whole room is this man beside me. So I am going to be careful, but I do think that there's even slight kind of very nuanced disagreement among us here at the table as we talked about it. But what was your general impression after you came into contact with the conversation?
Well, in general, it felt a lot like what you're saying to me, Jesse, in that you had these two sort of worlds that seem to never be able to come together in any real healthy way. So, because I don't know the context of, it seemed as if Sprinkle took a risk to sort of defend himself, and this other fellow came at him pretty strong, and so I was disappointed because it does seem to sort of characterize these sadly sort of polar opposites as it relates to how the church views this particular issue. So you kind of sat there, and if you enjoyed if you enjoy watching a fight, which a lot of men do, that there were some parts that,
I like good fights.
You got a bit of a chuckle out of it, but some of it was, lamentable because you just thought, I don't know that in the end we're actually progressing on either. No. So we sort of, disappointing. Evidently, multitudes of people watched, and
you said something 500,000.
500,000 people. Imagine. I heard, and you sit there and you think,
present, yeah.
Wow, that's to spend almost 2 hours, and I would have.
And you felt got nowhere.
If the goal is discernment, like I didn't feel like anything was. I didn't walk away.
No, I mean, I think there were
anyway.
some. I think, I mean, it was. You got two brothers. The context is awkward, right? In terms of was there any real desire to have restoration, or was there any real desire to repent of anything that was an infraction?
And I would add to it too. I don't know that there was real desire to create understanding, and I think that might be one of the more frustrating parts to me.
Yeah, so it was, I was not familiar with either. Right. So it was, I came in on the outside going, okay, what do we got here? So it was a little disappointing in that regard. You would have liked to see a little bit more genuine progress, and maybe some of the things we might talk about may help us to get down there a little bit, perhaps.
All right, so we'll work our way kind of back in the order that we just went. So we'll kind of start back with you, Pastor, and just one of the things that I think that you could really bring clarity to is because you're a pastor of a large church, and you've actually done something that has a corollary. They're not entirely similar, but there is a corollary. So we had last year James Lindsay come to our church. And one of the things that was brought up in the podcast was that Jared objected to the fact that that Preston would have people come to his church, come to his conferences. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but come to his conferences who disagree with him. Now, I want to try, because we don't have Preston here, I'll try to communicate what I thought Preston's response was, but ultimately I think Preston's response was this, is that the conference, which I believe is Exiles in Babylon, is essentially a conversation kind of platform where he doesn't necessarily endorse the values of the people who are coming there, but he wants to have these conversations with these people. And I would say that's true of us with James Lindsay. Like, we didn't have him here because we felt like he was a spiritual giant that needed to sow into us and give us some biblical interpretation. We had him here because there's an aspect of what's going on in culture that he is an expert on that we felt like we could benefit from. So to give it kind of like an Augustinian flavor, we could take the spoils of Egypt and use it for the glory of God. So potentially we could take even a man like James Lindsay and whatever information he could provide us about critical race theory and that kind of stuff, and then we can help inform the church with that. So maybe not just what was your takeaway, but what was your thought about the argument that Jared gave to Preston about his complicity in gender ideology and the transgender movement because he was platforming people who put pronouns in their bios?
Well, in our case, it was sort of whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are lovely, that the Holy Spirit would lead us and guide us into all truth. And I thought that as it related to what it is that's happening in culture and this particular issue of critical theory and all this, that James Lindsay brought an edifying message to the church on an issue that is just, true by itself. And he did so in a way that was, that issue was all by itself something edifying for a child of God to be able to grasp onto and glean from. In this particular case, obviously, Dr. Moore had done evidently some extensive research into who spoke at various times and what they're all about, and I think it's that's tricky because I think the church has got to be a place where we can have some conversations. I don't think it's Preston Sprinkle a shepherd of a flock. I mean, so there's a little bit of a difference there, but So I'd appreciate the church being able to have some difficult conversations. And, you know, we talked about it the last time we got together. There's been some men that have profoundly different lifestyles and worldviews that I appreciate being able to dialogue with. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that I actually have the accusation altogether pinpoint, but it seemed a little limited. And additionally, I don't know that it was ever defined as to whether or not the person who used their pronouns in their bio it was a man using he, him, meaning it wasn't a deceptive sort of scenario. It was just maybe a big bridge building kind of idea within a context where there may be people that, struggle with their own sexual identity, that maybe this particular speaker felt like, maybe I'll build a little bit of a bridge and I'll play that game. That's not for me at all. I think that's deceptive. I don't like heading down the line, but we never got to find out whether or not it was this use of pronouns was an actual complete, fraudulent thing. I'm a man who identifies as a woman, and now I'm going to speak to a group of people that are trying to navigate sexuality. That to me would be really frustrating. I never got to the real
I can't
crux.
Speak as somebody with experience on this, but my impression of the conversation was that these were just people who use pronouns in their bios, but not necessarily like trans people, if that's what you're...
I'd have to check. I'm almost certain there were several that did, and that there were several that spoke at the conference for Christians that were LGBTQ affirming.
Yeah.
That one was brought up because they knew they disagreed on that. They don't have to talk about those. They emphasized the one that said, well, what about, is it the pronouns or is it when it's actual trans pronouns?
Yeah.
That's when they brought up the guy that did it out of hospitality to say, is there any room to not be here?
They did bring it up?
That's the one that they brought up. But so they didn't, but I almost, again, you can check it, but I'm almost certain, I heard this a while back, that both things, that Preston had multiple people that had opposite pronouns and were LGBTQ affirming. So I think they already knew they disagreed so much. When he brought up the guy that had the same, he was trying to make the general point that could that not be for hospitality and not heresy?
Mm-hmm. And what's your thoughts? And by the way, I don't think whether or not he did or not is necessarily relevant to the more philosophical point that I think that needs to be discussed. Because the question is this permissible even in a conference that Preston Sprinkle is trying to endorse, and how should Christians address this topic? So should we use, like, out of deference to the individual in a personal one-on-one conversation, should we call that person Zzer or whatever, demon self, or whatever they want us to call it, right? So as confusing as it is, we're asking ourselves this question today in the modern church. So what was your ultimate takeaway in terms of that?
Yeah, so, can I touch on the Lindsay thing too? Before I go back to that? I think a massive difference between Lindsay coming and speaking at it's not parachurch organization, it's part of the church, but the civics and
culture.
Civics culture department. Yeah. That's bringing a non-Christian in to a type of church function, not like the pulpit, to teach on an issue that's inherently not Christian but has profound implications on the church. Yeah. Very different than having a conference, like we're all kind of picking on more a bit, but Preston doing that, it's incredibly problematic and unwise at the very least to have a conference for Christians and then to allow affirming people there to give that perspective.
And there's one more point of clarification real quick, is that when James Lindsay came, he was not taking the position that we disagree with, but rather trying to inform us about the position that we have.
Yes. And sadly, teaching the church better than a lot of people in the church. That's because he's teaching biblical truth, and a person that happens to be a non-Christian, that's way permissible.
Do we know the context of the conference? I'm not familiar with that. I heard him talk
it was just
about
navigating homosexuality with emphasis on parents to help talk with their kids through it. But they brought multiple affirming people to that to understand the perspective.
So generally the conference was about homosexuality.
Yeah, all the trans stuff probably, but yeah.
Okay. I didn't get that from their conversation.
They kind of brushed past all that.
Exiles in Babylon covers a lot of ground, but it essentially is kind of a Christian conference that tackles cultural issues.
I just didn't know but I didn't know if it was couched under the sort of general context of, hey, we're talking about lots of issues. This is not necessarily stuff that has been sorted through and or sort of pre-thought through from a discernment standpoint for Christian consumption. To kind of use at your own risk sort of thing. Does that make sense?
I don't know how nuanced.
I want to make sure that I understand.
Basically, it was like instruction for Christians to navigate these very contentious waters of LGBTQ stuff. That's at least what got, I don't know how broad they went, but that's what got all the press. That's what I'd heard about last year.
Okay.
So there can be points of disagreement among Christians on the degree to which you choose to use someone's pronoun out of a deference for hospitality. My conscience very strongly is to reject that and not to do that. I have a patient that I've watched transition. It's hard.
Yeah.
And I absolutely refuse. I give their new name because that's legal, and that's where I draw the line. I'll give the new name, a male or female name. But I draw, and so maybe I'm a heretic for that, right? I'm not going to call this dude with facial hair Kathy or whoever. That's not the real name of the patient, by the way. But and I came in once, had the hormone treatments, heard a low voice all of a sudden. He's trippy. You see it on TV, but man, I saw it. Over months, seeing this patient every 6 months. And yet the beauty of linguistics and syntax is you can just simply not say a pronoun. You can slip into it on accident. So that we are a little bit blessed in this scenario that we're not forced to be more contentious with this all the time. So I just won't say them. I can't say them. I can't not see it as affirming something that God doesn't affirm. As R.C. Sproul defined truth, its reality is perceived by God. And so I can't. This is where Joe Rigney got in a lot of trouble last year, talking about the sin of empathy. I think we talked about this last time, where sympathy versus empathy. Like, sympathy is I'm grabbing the tree branch and grabbing this hand to grab you out of the quicksand, but empathy is I'm jumping in headlong with you, right? And so, all truth is God's truth. And at some point we have to say, it's okay that you're offended, but I can't affirm something that's not only just like mildly untrue, like some random view about God that we can take it or leave it or disagree with and still be faithful Christians, but something like gender, which is God is a he. You attack gender, attack on gender is attack on God. This is extremely foundational. So would I ever put pronouns in my bio? I don't have any social media, but would I ever put those pronouns in out of any reason? Absolutely not. I'm also not going to call someone a heretic for it because their conscience may be there. I think it's very unwise. And I would tell them that, to the Christian personally. It goes without saying that no Christian should identify with pronouns other than the ones God gave them. I think we're all in obvious agreement there. But so that's where my conscience is at. There's no way I could use it. There's no way I could affirm that and say that to a person. I'm blown away that any Christian could have that. Wouldn't call him a heretic or whatever, but I'd say that's such serious error. That's where that whole balance, right, of like how far do we nuance? Bro, you're way too far on this side. There's no stories that I know of evangelistically of cowtailing to the deepest recesses of the most foundational theological sins like gender, softening someone's heart to where they're like, maybe tell me true, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, but man, how much do you step inside the worldview and reject your own? You go so far deep in that quicksand, man, how are you going to get out, So that's where I'm at with that.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I really, really want to jump into kind of the claim of heresy, because I will also take kind of a position that you do that I think Preston is in error, but not in heresy. So we'll get into heresy in just a moment. And I'll try to kind of explain it the way I have understood it so that we're not using it as an axe to cut off the heads of our brothers and sisters.
Sure.
But I will just say that I want to take a more historic approach too, to add to what you just said, that if you actually know where the whole idea of like pronoun usage and where the whole idea, because they get into a big conversation about gender and sex and the difference there. And that's very convoluted in my opinion. And I just don't know that, I think it would have been helpful to add this historic context, because I think this is helpful to Christians. If you know where the whole idea of gender ideology comes from, you know that euphemistically, it is straight from the pit of hell, and it is nothing that you can entertain. And it is nothing that you should toy with either. And so when you understand that the whole idea of differentiation between biological sex and gender came from John Money, a pedophile who's a total quack, whose first two patients committed suicide on him because he made two brothers, one that he tried to transition into a girl, simulate sex with each other and then take pictures of each other. His findings have been totally discredited. They're totally worthless. The individual that he first tried to transition, who had kind of a penile, it's the only time I've used penile on the podcast before, but penile, just accident, when he was born, and his penis was totally burnt off, and he tried to convince the parents of that child to turn that kid into, it's Bruce Reimer, by the way, to turn Bruce into a girl. When that totally backfired, and Bruce came out later, told the public what John Money had done to him, and then also said that although he tried to turn me into a girl, although he tried to put transvestites in front of me and convince me that I'm a girl and do all these things, and then even tried to make me have simulated sex with my brother, although he tried to do all of those things, you can never turn a boy into a girl. And I just think, I know there are the stories out there that we're telling everybody about how much gender dysphoria went away the moment that surgery took place in the individual. We are toying with a fire here that we don't even know the depth of, but what we do know already is a suicide epidemic of epic proportions. And I just think as a Christian, we have an obligation to our conscience to do a little bit better than just be like, in all fairness, to just say, well, if he's he, him, and he's using he, him in his pronouns, well then okay. That is an implicit endorsement of, I think, a very dangerous and satanic ideology that we have no business placing in the church. And I'll just put it this way, maybe to go even further back in history, I can't imagine the disciples sitting around fighting with each other as to whether or not we should be having church conferences with this kind of stuff going on, right?
No.
I mean, I just can't imagine that. And that's not to be just like anachronistic. I know it's something that's going on in the culture. It's something that needs to be addressed. But this is where I do think Preston is in error. And I don't know that Jared did the best job of trying to communicate that, because I think the issue of heresy got in his way. So I don't want to miss the opportunity for you, Chris. Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's okay. Any thoughts about the heresy in particular?
No, not heresy. Just in terms of like pronouns and bio and difference between gender and sex.
Well, I mean, I think that fundamentally we live in a culture that is obsessed with self. They're obsessed with self, right? And anytime we're obsessed with self is when we're putting ourselves in God's position.
Yeah.
Right. We're idolizing ourselves. We're making ourselves idols, right? I think that's collective heresy. That's sin. That's what it is, right? It's the Tower of Babel, And gender ideology is the exact same thing. It's just sort of, I'm looking for a sense of myself. I don't have an identity. I don't have an identity in Jesus. The disciples, the apostles, were looking at first century Judea. I mean, they're doing everything they could just not to be persecuted by the Jews and persecuted by the Greeks, and they're trying to set up this church. I mean, they're doing everything they can just to live and experience the Holy Spirit and go, hey, we're just going to grow this church thing, right? I mean, they're more worried about just getting their daily bread, having community, sharing the gospel. I mean, their lives had identity. Their lives had meaning. And we're so devoid of meaning. And, when it comes down to it, like this, the gender ideology stuff, I can appreciate it because it's washed up on my shore in some very specific ways. I have a background in social science, so I see a lot of this stuff as well. For me, it's just another expression of a missing identity that we have, and it's been hyper accelerated, talking from a technology standpoint, it's been hyper accelerated by the technology we have. And I think, and we can return to this later, but I think that is because technology is a tool set. The new technology we have is a tool set that's a meaning machine. It's a meaning machine. The previous sets of technology, Industrial Revolution, we're using
machines.
They're producing machines. Yeah, we're offloading our labor. Now we've offloaded our meaning, and we're gaining our meaning through a conduit, like a smartphone. So I think that's one of the reasons why people are constantly grappling with these identities, and they're sort of shifting around. This is constantly changing. As far as the conversations about whether or not that's heretical or not, it's, and whether, I know we're getting away from Sprinkle and whether or not what he was saying was heretical. If we're talking about heresy in general, I think, yeah, absolutely. This is all sinful. It's all sinful, but it's all just an expression of the same sin, which is, I'm God, God's not God. Right? I'm God. You have to, pronouns are a perfect example of that. No, I'm not, I understand there are people who do it for professional purposes, there's people who do it for different things, but the active use of pronouns is me going, I have an identity that I've grounded myself in. You can't touch it. If you violate that, then you violate me as a human being. That's how fragile I am. because I've woven this web of identity together,
Yeah.
right? And that's
that
tragic.
made me want to kind of research even the phrase sexual identity. If you know where it comes from, I'd love to hear it. But I didn't really find anything. But the whole idea, and it's almost commonplace now, even for people in church, to say sexual identity as though that exists, which it doesn't.
Yeah.
Because we don't get our identity from who we have sex with. It's a complete perversion of what identity really
It's an
is.
activity, not an identity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what you choose to do with your body is an entirely different thing than who you are.
Ultimately, yeah, for sure.
And and then to piggyback on what you were just talking about in terms of meaning, I mean, we are sicker, emptier, more depressed, more culturally we are. You drift that far away from your creator, you end up and you become God.
You do.
You realize that you aren't capable, and you are, talk about a recipe for depression, suicide, abuse, all sorts of vices. I mean, it's just a deluge of like, I'm empty, fill me, I'm empty, fill me, I'm empty, fill me, I'm empty, fill me, and all, it's a new identity. And then of course it's just simple, like you said, it's simple, fallen, rebellious nature to the ultimate. I mean, I think this sort of new iteration is, all these lines that God designed that were healthy, distinctions between males and females, and we could even talk about national borders and what a marriage is, what a marriage isn't. Then you get down to the very fundamental of just what a male, a female, and then essentially it's like, no, I reject that, and I will be. I mean, that's a terrifying statement, right? I will be. I am.
It is.
Yeah.
Whoa. I mean, that's anti. I mean, it's pretty demonic, right? In the end,
It is. It is.
It's empty. I am what I say I am.
Yeah.
You're going.
Well,
Wow,
I think
careful.
I think that's a point that Dr. Moore could have made. I wish he would have made.
Yeah.
Is that when you do that, when you make a proclamation like, hey, these are my pronouns, use these, or you're written off in my book. You are saying that. You're saying that I have an identity that supersedes my identity in Jesus, right? And that could go for anything. It could go for good stuff. Yeah. You could say, I'm an American Christian. Like, honestly, we really should be saying I'm a Christian who's an American, right?
True.
I mean, we can love our country, we can be patriotic, we can do all that sort of stuff, but ultimately, Jesus is the king. He sits on the throne, and our lives should be living sacrifices, right, to Him, And it's like anytime that I want to put that in front of, put some sort of qualifier in front of my faith, I'm basically saying, hey, this is a part of me that's untouchable. That's an identity that's couched in something else that the gospel can't get at.
Yeah, I think about that with social justice.
Yeah.
Like, we should be after justice, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I'm deeply disturbed with what social justice is and what some people mean by that term. There is no necessary qualifier to justice. Justice is good enough.
Yeah.
If you want to put one on there, put biblical justice, but then we're still talking about what justice is at the end of the day. But kind of back to your point about kind of like what the demonic is and what Satanism actually is, and the way in which the self is celebrated in our present culture. It reminded me of the I will statements of Satan in the Bible, and again, this is, we see these conferences about LGBTQ and stuff like that, but where's the conference that's like, come die to self? So there's this guy that I saw on X the other day, used to be Twitter, and he said this. He said, this holiday, do not invite LGBTQ plus family and friends to churches with toxic doctrine that push people further from God. Don't invite them to family tables that will inflict trauma. Don't invite them to situations where they are not fully loved as is. First, create safe spaces, then rebuild bridges. And he put Christmas cheese around there just to emphasize that. Now, not only is that incredibly soft and just rubs me the wrong way, but it's also fundamentally wrong because it is simply about the individual to the degree that, like, Jesus is lost in the midst of it all. And so I responded to this individual and I just said, invite them to the cross. Like, we're so concerned with style over substance these days anyway, but where is that message? That message of dying to self? We're so concerned about pronouns and so concerned about whether there's a difference between gender and sex, which, by the way, I think I almost agreed with Preston on that. I think he tended to say that gender is a totally unnecessary construct. So I would say, yeah, let's totally get rid of it. We don't need it. We just need biological sex. So needless to say, on the subject of saying, yeah, it's a horrible segue, but let's talk about that. Let's talk about heresy real quick, because I think this is one of the fundamental things. There's one more thing I want to get to with this conversation, but I was concerned, maybe you guys were too, with the way in which heresy was thrown around. I'm going to give you my impression, then I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about it. The reason I think it's important that we don't quickly label people, and I would even say Preston Sprinkle a heretic, is because I want to create a tent not big enough to make myself feel better about being nice, but big enough for people like Preston so that we can understand that there are people in Big Evo, there are brothers and sisters who deeply are in error on some issues that need to be corrected, and that there's space for these people to come into the kingdom and still have these very spiritually bankrupt ideas. Now I'm going to take a risk here and give an analogy. So if a liberal San Francisco woman in her late 20s decides to move to Chattanooga because she realizes that she doesn't want to live in the Communist Republic of California anymore and she wants to live among the land of the free. And she comes to Calvary Chapel. She gets saved. And she's a born-again believer on fire for the Lord. On the day after Sunday, on Monday, does she lose her pro-choice views? And I think the obvious answer to that is probably not. That's going to have to come off of her through a period of time and through a period of sanctification and through education in the Christian faith and all of those things. And so all I'm saying is that there's room, not necessarily for the pro-choice Christian, but there's room for people who have flawed, erroneous ideas that then we need to come alongside and help them. If we too quickly throw them out, then all we're doing is abdicating our responsibility to disciple people who have horrible ideas and who are being influenced by the world.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking for pure Christianity, I should probably hit the bricks right now, honestly. I'm just going to be straight up. Like that's this is, I try to live as close to orthodoxy as possible. I try to be as discerning as I can be, but, I recognize my own sinfulness every single day. I mean, golly, I need the cross. I need the cross every day, And I think that we start throwing the word around heresy. I think that all of a sudden we're just going, hey, this is in-out crowd. You're pure, you're not pure, and that's a dangerous world.
If that's the definition in the end, yeah. I mean, that was sort of my general idea, is that the heretic was the one that was called out because he or she or they advocated things that would lead.
Wait, they? Just kidding. Nothing.
Yeah, the group. I meant they as in the group, not as another way. But to say then that it seems that there was, that Paul and others would call out those that were heretical in the church, but their doctrine would leave folks with the impossible, leave them outside of the context to be saved because the doctrine about Christ was wrong, whatever. This issue, to me, I thought, heresy is kind of a heretic, meaning one who is lost.
Yeah.
Because of that particular, I thought, gosh, that's a strong, that's a strong accusation. In error versus a heretic seemed a little bit.
Would you say that the accusation didn't match the rhetoric when Jared was, being an interlocutor of Preston?
Yeah, no, I sat there and I thought, and then, a little disturbing was when Preston would say, I have never said, I have never believed, I don't believe now. Mm-hmm. So I'm telling you, brother to brother, I do not believe this particular statement. I do not believe. I never have. I've never thought it, never written it. I've got people on my staff that would by their very existence and their lifestyle defend this. And, so could you just repent for misrepresenting my view? And the guy's like, no.
Mm-hmm. Well, because you get by association, you kept saying, well, does anyone in that group that you invited?
Well, golly,
they do.
Sure.
That's separate. So say you're really unwise to platform them. That's fair. he can't say he himself is a heretic when he's just clearly corrected that for you.
Yeah.
They're never going to be friends, but he should have recanted that criticism.
Yeah.
Because, the word heresy historically is a little convoluted, kind of like evangelical, like we've said. Like, you can look up the history of it, and it's to a degree the words change meaning. Right? Give a lot of...
Fundamentalist has too.
100%. So it doesn't mean it did not mean at a certain time. There are definitely examples in church history of the word being used in a lot of writings in ways that were not salvific. Generally, though, it does hold a soteriologic assumption because we're talking about like councils. He mentioned, I see Dr. Morgan, look at Michael Servetus, Calvin, right? Like, there's so many examples of like, dude, if you're a heretic, we might, depending on the time and the...
You may be
Yeah, like St. Nick, we slapping you in the face and kicking you out of the council.
Bro,
See
you might
it.
be burned alive, guillotine, pelt rocks at your face, buried to the shoulder until you're dead in front of the town. Like, there's brutal church history. And we throw it out on Twitter, you're a heretic. I want you to be murdered in front of your family. It's like, dude, we got to be so careful with our language. So again, generally, I think, I don't know how Dr. Moore was using the term, but I'm pretty sure it had a soteriologic implication. So I've heard this three-prong sort of triad that I think would be helpful to discern these issues of receive, reject, redeem. We bring someone into the fold, the pro-choice thing, whatever. Certain things you can receive as is. You believe marriage, I believe marriage, okay? You might say it's a man and woman, we're going to talk about that, but I'm not... That's more redeemed. Like, there's certain things you see, like you said, they believe Christ is king, doctrine of Christ, we're good, okay. Like, your identity's in him, great. Certain things you redeem, like marriage. You're halfway there. You got the male and woman part, but you're including this man or woman, right? And then there's things you reject. Well, I think Christians can watch porn. No discussion, no nuance, reject. Receive, reject, redeem. It takes wisdom to know what those are. And certainly, I mean, 2 John, they went out of us because they were not of us. They went out from us because they were not of us. If they were of us, they would never have gone out from us. A big verse for Reformed guys, right? So you were never even part of the fold. So there are things, and Paul will call people out to their face, like Peter, right? Where no, this isn't nuance. Certain things you have to reject to be in Christ.
Yeah.
You have to reject. But to say everything that's not exactly the way I do it is rejecting because of association is heretical, and if you're applying it soteriologically, that you're saying you're not, you're saying you're going to hell right now.
Yeah.
Now, if he was straight up affirming, you have a lot more of a lot. No, you can say he's unwise. You cannot say Preston's himself affirming.
Yeah, no way.
He was clear. Clear.
As clear as can be.
So my thoughts on this, and this is where you can call me a heretic now. My thoughts on heresy, I have a very succinct definition of it. I would love to hear what you have to say about this. But it's also important to me because I've seen this done before. Like, I know somebody who called William Lane Craig a heretic, and I'm like, dude, William Lane Craig has done more for the body of Christ than you will do in 2 of your lifetimes. Just simply because William Lane Craig was on a podcast with another guy that was talking about allegorical interpretation and literal interpretation of Scripture. And I'm just like...
Simply because he had the discussion.
Well, also because he had different views in terms of creation. And young earth creationism, and whether or not we should take that literally and all that kind of stuff. And it just, so this person took a very literal interpretation of Scripture, and it was my point to them, like, I don't think you take everything literally, but needless to say, just the idea, without getting into too much of the weeds here, of calling William Lane Craig a heretic, I thought was just like, was out of bounds. And all I'll say is this, in my definition of heretic, and I think we need to be careful about this because when I infer heretic, I don't mean brother in error. I mean a person who's outside of the Christian faith.
Absolutely.
So what I have always been taught and what I've always thought is that heresy is specific to Christology. So if you have a false view of Christ, now you are a heretic.
Jehovah's Witness.
Correct. Mormons, those kind of things.
You go down the list of, right.
Yep. So some people would object to that and say, well, Reed, that's a little bit too confining a definition. Like, couldn't everything... couldn't you argue that everything has to do with Jesus? And I'm like, no, like whether you sprinkle or submerge has nothing to do with Jesus, right? And that's a difference of style and denomination, but not necessarily heresy. And so when we get down to Christology, the nature of Christ, divine, man, second person of the Trinity, the only sinless, the only way to salvation through faith in what he did for us on the cross, belief in the resurrection, the literal resurrection, belief in his virgin birth. So those things are what makes up the foundation for orthodoxy to me. What do you guys think about that?
I'm good with that. I would just expand it a little more broadly to say the doctrine of God proper throughout the Reformation. Just because I just immediately thought of T.D. Jakes and modalism, which I guess Christ would cover because he's not. But if you only focus on Christ, you don't know that the Spirit's the same person. It's not three persons. Modalism, they're different manifestations or modes. But yeah, I mean, you create over creative baptism, post millennial, bro. You're going to. It's like, come on. Yeah, it's got. I'd say the doctrine of God. Anything deviation from that would be non-soteriological.
That's why you probably thought in this particular case, and that's the way I've that's the way I've understood it. So I thought, and that's a double-barreled shotgun,
Sure.
Which I thought, has the man no struggles himself in any way? You know, I mean, could you find out that you may be in error in some place?
Yeah. Or someone you associated with is an error.
Oh, yeah.
Heaven forbid.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I didn't find that to be a legitimate criticism. I mean, to criticize the views or whatever, but to go that far, I mean, and then, to have any hope of two brothers having any sort of, that either one of them would come in any way closer to one another, which to a certain degree, would honor Christ, right? I thought it was noble of Sprinkle to take a shot at that. I thought he handled himself well in many instances. And so I thought that was worthy. And maybe disappointing that the doctrinally pure fella came off. I don't know that his behavior, necessarily adorned the gospel that he champions, and I think that's sad. That's a disappointment.
I think he was defining it so broadly that he was considering any deviation from any of the larger or shorter catechisms in the Westminster Confession to be heresy, which is an explicitly reformed document. Like then, by application, you're saying Arminians are heretics. Like if you're taking a checkpoint of hundreds and hundreds of things, which we should take seriously, deviation from any one of them to be heretical, that's just such a wide umbrella. It's just hard, really hard to see that as wise.
All right, well, there's one last thing that I think is relevant to talk about, and I think there's going to be a lot of people who come away from the conversation and look at, and it even came up in the conversation, look at the demeanor of Jared and his mood. Yeah. So I want to talk about the mood of a Christian. And this is a tricky thing, and this is where balance, I think, is absolutely necessary. And there may even be some disagreement around the table with this, but I have a pretty wide tent when it comes to mood, because maybe I'm just a moody guy, but I believe that there's a place for the Matt Walshes of the world who are blunt instruments that are saying some things that some Christians might deem unwise. And here's the way I think about this, and I'd like to kind of hash this out with you guys, but also maybe within the context of Jared and Preston. But I would like to hear what you think about my idea on this subject. So I believe that mood is predicated upon subject. So if the mood requires, if the subject matter requires that bedside manner go to the wayside, then I'm absolutely fine with that. So let me just put it this way. If my kid cut his hand, is sticking his hand in the shark tank, I may slap my son out of the way so that he doesn't get his hand bitten off. And it is not because I'm abusive, it is because I deeply love my son and I know what he's doing. I would say that for many people who have, and maybe this is a dangerous statement, but nonetheless I'll say it. I believe many people who have been somewhat indoctrinated and matrixized by the culture are going to come away from the conversation with Jared and Preston and say, I think that Jared was too harsh to Preston. And I think he was harsh in one way, but in another way, the subject matter matters so much that I do believe that he was only harsh in that he didn't do the subject matter justice. So when your mood doesn't provide extra clarity to the subject matter and you're taking away from the truth, then I think that that is detrimental to the argument and detrimental to the subject. But I do believe that in keeping with the subject matter that they're talking about, I believe that gender ideology perhaps is, and I've even heard you say something similar to this, I think gender ideology is kind of a modern day test, a litmus test for the church on where people stand on the faith, just because of how prominent it is in the culture and how demonic the temptation to give in to these ideas truly is. There's a social cost for taking a biblical stance on the issues of biblical sexuality, and there is a lot of adulation and praise for the man that is going to be wishy-washy and a coward on this subject. So my whole thought is that I think the mood is determined upon the subject, and I think the subject matter deserves a strong mood if you're able to make a convincing case. But if you're not, then all you're doing is stepping on your own toes.
I would ask, the one thing I don't know is I don't really know what Mr. Moore was trying to accomplish. I would love to know what the motivation is. You know, you're having this conversation, you're having a conversation with the pastor, he's very prominent, he's got a lot of things going on. Like, what are you trying to accomplish by basically saying you're a heretic, right? I mean, that to me should set the mood, right? That should set the mood. I've never, and I'd be a little bit different than you on this, Reed, and I totally respectfully, I've never won someone to Christ by being dogmatic with them. I've had really great conversations with them. We've talked about how maybe I've been transformed through your sanctification, and my life is different than it was, and my worldview has shifted because Christ has revealed something to me. There are things that have adjusted me, and I'm not saying that I would ever advocate for being soft in any sort of way. But at the same time, I don't find that the gospel is shared at the end of a cudgel, personally, you know. And now this is a conversation between two people who are theologically knowledgeable, right? So they should be speaking the same language. But my feeling is that as far as mood goes, the one thing that threw me off just listening to it was just the mood felt extreme from the very beginning. It's sort of like, you're a heretic, I'm not a heretic, let's have a conversation. And then, an hour and a half later, I'm like, you guys have made no ground, right? Yeah. You're just splitting hairs. And that was my feeling. It just, I don't know what you guys kind of thought about that.
I was frustrated on both sides. Let me kind of turn this to Jesse and see what you think about that. And maybe there's a difference too in what you said between personal one-on-one conversations and corporate conversations in terms of dogmatism. Because I think that there's a purpose when people are listening to for their sake and not necessarily for the person's sake that you're speaking to. So there may be something there. But let me give you an analogy that'll kind of also flesh out this thing. You may know what you want to say about this anyway, but Kevin DeYoung just wrote an article. Are you familiar with him? Just wrote an article about Doug Wilson in Mood, and he called it the Moscow Mood. And he was, have you seen this?
I know all of those, yeah.
Okay, so the whole idea is just simply that he's critiquing Doug Wilson because he thinks that he's only drawing people because of a certain mood, kind of a more militant form of Christianity and whatnot. So they've kind of gone back and forth at this point in time. I caught the video of Doug Wilson responding to this the other day. I thought it was very charitable. I thought it was maybe a good example of maybe what a conversation between brothers who disagree should look like. But I gotta say, I really agree with Doug Wilson on this, that if the mood serves the purposes of the gospel and serves the message, then you're hard pressed to argue that the mood is interfering with that. And if the mood is creating the mood, I think Doug Wilson said this: if the mood is creating good fruit, then let the fruit speak for itself. It's kind of what I think Doug Wilson said. So you can speak to that if you want to, but just kind of curious what you think about mood and the place for that.
I think about this stuff so much, dude. It's interesting. On that case, I'm just to close that book, I'm just as 100% as Team Wilson as you could be, as Team Moscow. There's like 50 things I want to say about that. I've consumed a lot about that. So on that one, I'm totally Team Moscow on the mood thing, but this broader discussion in the evangelical broadosphere on those pretty closely to the right, I'm usually the one I'm really frustrated with tone is more the word that'll be used up.
Yeah.
More like in individual conversations and podcasts and stuff. That a lot of the people on the right, man, I think unfortunately Dr. Moore is an example of this. Like we witnessed, at least at that one point we talked about, straight up black and white, no nuance. you learn perspective about Preston with that one thing that, he didn't actually, that wasn't him, that was one of the guys on his board or whatever.
Yeah.
So call it unwise, but you have to correct, you misrepresented me on a tweet. I think the tweets got 500,000 views, by the way. And we just witnessed pride on camera that failed to recant. You know what Proverbs says? It's dangerous language, bro. I just power read the Proverbs last week, so if you ever do that, you don't take a lot of notes, you like, over and over. You're like, wow, it says it 5 times. Like,
yeah.
How many times it says, rebuke a wise man, you know what? He'll love you. You just gain a friend. Rebuke a fool, he will hate you. A couple chapters later says, what is it? I want to get it right. A rebuke into a man of understanding. It's like you don't want to be the stupid one, the foolish one. You don't want to be the one who learns and has understanding in the Proverbs, obviously. But a rebuke goes deeper into a man of understanding than 100 blows into a fool. They just don't get it. So yeah, I think more in terms of tone and like the way that guys engage online. Because most of the guys, I'm like, I agree with you on content, and they bring up tone all the time because they're constantly criticized for it, and they do not take into account, dude. It's really, really, really frustrating to me. So this is separate from the Moscow thing because he's a very charitable, sweet guy. Talking about the guys that are super, kind of like the Moors.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Moors. He said, I'm just direct, man. Bro, I think about this so much. 2 Corinthians 2, bro. And I'm a guy, I've been called toxically masculine a lot. I get it. I don't care at all about that.
Yeah, you don't have to bring in your marriage to the conversation.
Yeah. She's never said that. She's never said that. But I don't have to focus on Joshua be bold. I focus on this gentleness stuff because it's a struggle for me. Because men are tough and tender. The Moors of the world like to talk about Jesus turning over the tables and, I'm going to tie a millstone around your neck if you cause the kids to go astray. And those same kids felt gentle to come to him. Let little children come to me. Get on my lap. Men are tough and tender. And I'm just direct. 2 Corinthians 2. For we are the pleasing aroma of Christ. To those who are, I love how ESV renders it, being saved, sort of present, ongoing justification, which does fit in penal substitutionary atonement. That's another thing. To those who are being saved, and who? The perishing. You're talking to someone you know is lost? They're the pleasing aroma of Christ. One of the qualifications for elders in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 is being well thought of by outsiders. They may still want to kill you like Jesus, but amongst themselves, they're like, bro, he actually did do my case for free at work. He actually did do a lot for the community. He did listen and ask more questions than anybody else. He served me. He asked me what he could do for me, right? Hate him because his views, he's a bigot. He's a solid dude. Qualification for elder. Paul says elsewhere, let your language be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer each person. So there's individual context there, kind of like what's the subject too? Who's the person? What's the subject? What's the severity? Elsewhere, Paul says, correct your opponents. There's correction. I'm thankful these guys hash it out, man. Let's quit being feminine. Let's talk about our differences. Tell me why I'm wrong. It's a prerequisite to be my friend. You got to tell me I'm off. Hey, man, I don't like the way you talk to your wife like that. Like, if you're not going to call me on that, why are we even friends? Is iron sharpens iron, right? So correct your opponents. What's the rest of the verse? But with gentleness and respect. Galatians 5, what's one of the fruits of the Spirit? Gentleness. That's not for women. It's for Christians. So I get I'm just increasingly getting really annoyed by a lot of guys who I consume their content regularly because they're the only ones speaking truth, and there ain't too many of those, who just think they have a free pass
Just blast away.
Just blast away. Such a break. Look, I consume Kenneth Owens and Charlie Kirk regularly. I love them. And at the same time, there are times when they're so abrasive and snarky, that is not honoring to Christ, period.
Sure.
I don't expect it from a superior. He's not a Christian, right? But you know who I think, I'll give you an example, I'll finish. I'll talk all day on this stuff. But I think the best example I've seen on this consistently the last 3 years, overwhelmingly, now content-wise it's Wilson, but in terms of the aroma of Christ, you cannot tell me any different.
Reed Huberman.
Yes, we were thinking.
That's right.
We all are unanimous.
Good job there. But when you throw in the cheerfulness component, because Wilson actually believes taking out emotion. I've heard him say, Douglas Wilson, that in sermons, if he'll like pretend like he's got to blow his nose and like make sure no one sees him like crying or whatever. He does not believe that emotion should. He just preaches pretty straightforward. He seems like he's actually a very sweet, emotive guy, but it's all about preach the word and let God do the work. But it's John Cooper, of skill. Have you been hearing about him? He started going against all the woke stuff. And he's got a new book, Weak with Being Woke, or Woke Weak and Wimpy, something like that.
Yeah.
Dude, he is the most cheerful, sweet, smart, just self-deprecating, doesn't take himself seriously, really kind, hammers the woke stuff. I don't know how he does it so well. And he's so freaking, nobody could say he's a jerk, not one.
Yeah, he spends like an hour screaming at people at his concerts, but off stage he's very kind of...
He's a rocker. It's the whole thing.
It's catharsis, man.
Yeah.
Dude, he is a perfect example of how we are to be correctly winsome, because again, the guy's hijacked the winsome thing, and it's just compromise. He's a flawless example, in my estimation, of how to engage in the culture war with perfect discernment, give no quarter, no compromise, but he just exudes the pleasing aroma of Christ. I'm really frustrated that there's one guy can say that's it.
Well, I want to
Come back to
Well, hold on. I want to mention something.
Yeah.
I love that you use that sort of. You use the phrase "no quarter," like no quarter, no compromise. I love that. I think that we can. I think that we can absolutely be that. I mean, that's one of the things that we're missing in this conversation, right? Is that you can absolutely be that. And be loving at the same time, right? We be that and be loving at the same time. And the thing is, the culture needs that. The culture desires that. The culture desires a sense of objective reality, of constancy, of being able to dig into meaning and have a conversation about what is the underlying motivation behind everything that's happening here, right? And they go, I'm worldviewless. I don't know what I'm doing. Like my devices tell me who I am. My peers tell me who I am. I look in the mirror, and Charles Cooley, the really famous social scientist, he would say that we look into the mirror. We have the looking glass self. We're looking and we're developing our identities based on the reflection that we see, right? And how we feel like other people are seeing around us, right? And these are the things we're looking for. And when you walk in with a real Jesus, right? And you walk in and you can meet somebody where they are. It's unbelievable. People just gravitate towards it. Yeah. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would only add that I think, and this might appear self-serving, and maybe in the end it is. I've found that the context can be interesting, because as a shepherd who feels a profound sense of responsibility to warn sheep of wolves and wolvish ideas, it's not always as easy. You take, again, you talk about the guys that sort of give everything's a pass, and everything is Christ turning over the tables. Everything is. And but there is a time for that. I mean, there is a time where the caption in the newspaper would have caught Christ with the whip in his hand and the vein sticking out of his neck, and like lowly Jesus, meek and mild, where to go? I find that for me is quite a challenge. I think I still am applying myself to trying to rightly train, equip, warn sheep of the errors that will destroy. And maybe that was Mr. Moore's goal. Mm-hmm. He just never got around to describing it in such a way that it would have been winsome enough to go, I would like to pay attention to this, because you actually care about these very destructive ideas that will destroy people's lives. Mm-hmm. So I do find that for myself, I often wrestle after the fact, again in a cultural moment like the one that we're facing, where we're trying to make sense of all that's coming at us so quick. I've looked back several times and felt like I had the staff out, and I've had it out a lot, I guess on the one hand you hope that the ABCs and the elementary nature of what we're to be isn't lost, and so when you take on issues like the agendas of the LGBTQ, mob, and my heart for someone who struggles with same-sex attraction, there's the public declaration of truth that isn't going to be. I've heard that there were some in the community that were taking snippets of my whatever I would say, anything along the lines of homosexuality, then post it because I'm not on social media and everything.
Sure.
And it was evidently some homosexual people, and it was meant to be like, hey, look at the hater.
I thought it was great. I'm just kidding.
No, I never. No, but I mean, it was just like, that's, how do you then, stand, give no quarter, in a way that doesn't come across in that tone or mood that can be so aggressive, and that's something to really think through. That's something to really think through. I as a listening, you go, man, I thought that the Preston sort of handled himself with far more grace and patience with this man, and he was just sort of a bulldog, nipping. And I thought, man, that is not the kind of representation that I would like. But I find the tone and the mood to be something that can be difficult in my particular arena, where I'm the communication context is large, and you can't say everything that needs to be said and cover every, please don't misunderstand me. If I make a comment about the folly of having some of these discussions, I'm in the back of my mind, I'm like, don't forget to say, like, if anyone's here struggling with same sex, struggling with your gender, we're sorry. It's just, it can be very difficult to navigate that. I guess in the end, we can grow, thank God. And then sometimes I suppose you have to trust it. Put it this way, I've won arguments and lost the capacity. I've lost friends, and I've actually, brothers. And you go, well, that's something I did far more early on than something that I regret deeply. I won the argument, doggone it. I mean, I was right.
Yeah.
But I lost in the end. There was a division there that God, I wasn't quite around the corner enough to know that God hates division, and I was for something that was debatable. Where there could be latitude, I won the argument, and that's a little bit of what I think we watched in that video. I want to win. I just want to win and be right. And you could have conveyed that a little bit better. Oh, why? Because it matters. People are going to suffer.
Yeah.
These ideas have consequences, and so to play around with them are going to be like, you don't want to be a part of leading anybody down a path that's going to destroy them. Something along those lines could have set the tone a little bit better to go,
absolutely.
Oh, he's just not hell-bent on being right, or haven't been on being right. He does care that, getting this wrong isn't just a matter of right and wrong. I mean, this is going to destroy people. So it's a tricky thing. I like the way you position it. That mood is it has a context in which, if it's winsome and fruitful and appropriate, by all means, Christ definitely demonstrated that. But on the whole, just to be a blast always.
It's like if you write an email in all caps, you lost them. Emphasis, right?
Well, I mean, this is a worldview conversation. I think that I agree. I think that if he would have led with a sort of, this is going to impact people's worldviews, right? You have a lot of people, you have a lot of influence. You have a giant podium that you can speak from, and people, if they see, and I'm not going to call you a heretic, but if they see that you're endorsing somebody that's teaching something, and that leads somebody into a place where they're astray, like, you've done the enemy's work for him. You know what I mean? Like, from the inside out. Like, are you aware that that's the case, right? But that's a much different conversation, right? And I think that we all need to be about that. We know, and I think one of the reasons why we're doing this, and Reed, you've been so great about leading this, is that we know how easy it is for a small worldview nuance to usurp God's sovereignty, right? Completely in someone's life. And all of a sudden it turns into, and this is going back to the identity conversation, it turns into like, this is my identity, right? And my identity is now apart from God because I believe this little thing that wove itself into my life, and then all of a sudden it is the core of who I am. And I mean, I that might be one of those ways that we have to that might be the tightrope that we have to walk, to be corrective.
Can I share one quick story that made me think of? There's a book D.A. Carson has, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's the provost. And it's about his dad, sort of a tribute to his father after he passed. And he shared this memory. It's always stuck in my mind. It was small, humble church, like 40 people or something. And it was a normal Sunday. And he goes to find his dad in his office. You need to ask him something. And he usually did some stuff in his office after the sermon. And he sees through the crack in the door, his dad's on his knees, weeping on the ground. Just a regular Sunday. For the souls of non-believers, he knew he was there. So, to the Dr. Moore, to any of us, when's the last time you wept for that family member that's not saved? Where's your brokenness for people that don't know Christ? Mm-hmm. 2 Corinthians 5:17, anyone who's in Christ is a new creation. The old has passed away, the new has come. That's going to decide why. Yeah. It's not enough to say that you're celibate and gay Christian. It's not enough to say, no, God healed the gay. It's a change of orientation, side X. But side Y is no, it's your new person. You have a new nature. Ontologically, you're different. Mm-hmm. And you want people to experience that, or just that even if we're always straight or whatever, just that.
By the way, I just want to insert this real quick. I think if we could take Jared's kind of position on anything, I would say, I believe that's why Jared was so passionate in speaking the way that he was, is that I think he's trying to underscore how important it is for people to know that they can be delivered from this, rather than to toy with the idea and just express the idea and explore the idea, but to make sure that people know that there's freedom from this thing. Yeah. So I think that there was a redemptive aspect that he was trying to aim at, even if he didn't communicate it well.
Yeah, I'm sure he has deep. If you glance at his Twitter feed, you do see a deep passion for people to think correctly about homosexuality. I just can't imagine some person on the fence looking for questions. As problematic as Preston is, dude, they're going to ask him questions. Mm-hmm. They're not going to go to Jared's page and see a man who weeps for homosexuals because he wants them to know the freedom of Christ. They won't feel that. I'm not the feeling. The 11th commandment ain't true, bro. Thou shalt be not nice is not true. But kindness is one of the fruits of the Spirit.
However, I'm curious what they get when they go to Preston. Right? I think they would be better off going to Jared.
I'm not team either of them. If you're going to reach out, 100%, 1,000,000%, reach out to Jared Moore if you're questioning. Absolutely no question. What I'm saying is I think they're less likely to. That's the problem, because we don't actually think Preston's wise on this stuff.
Yeah. So there's got to be a way of balance. And you're going to hear me contradict myself, and then, I don't know. You're going to hear me contradict myself repeatedly in what I'm about to say. But just a couple of thoughts, because I think this is an issue of balance. And I almost think we see this in the scripture too, in terms of things that seemingly contradict each other, but really it's just trying to help us shape a holistic worldview on this stuff. But hearing all of this makes me just think, guys, and obviously in a much lesser position than you, but on my podcast, I get tone policed all the time, right? And I just wonder how much anymore in our culture today that is so anti-truth that you're really not going to be labeled somebody that has tone issues or somebody that's being too dogmatic or whatever. I also know that courage is way harder than cowardice, and there's going to be ways in which we have to push against ourselves in the sanctification process, push against our niceness that is more cultural than it is Christian in order to truly obey Christ sometimes. I'm just going to tell you, and we can at a different time hash out contextuality here, but there are people in the Bible that make you feel uncomfortable with the way that they handle things, and we have to be willing to accept that. And the other thing is, I would say, and this is kind of taking the other side here, I also wonder about idolatry and whether or not anger is idolatry. You know what I mean? If it's just way easier to express ourselves in anger because that leans into who we are by nature. I hope that's not true of me, but I also know this, man, this is probably one of the things that I struggle with the most in terms of how do I effectively confront but not be contentious? How do I wade into this issue as assertively as is necessary based upon the reality of what this thing will do in people's life, but also do it in a way where people understand my heart and they don't misperceive my motives? Mm-hmm. And then the other thing too is that like I'm really deeply concerned that we have so many cowards that we need to communicate a message that almost pushes people towards making mistakes so that they will be okay understanding you're going to screw this up, but you will not get it right unless you screw up, unless you try. If you avoid conflict, and I think the church has done this for far too long, you will never be good at the thing that you always avoid. And so we have to wade into conflict even if we mess up and make mistakes, I think, so that we can learn how to do it effectively, so that God can reprove us, so that the people who we're talking to can even potentially reprove us, so that we can get it right. I just know this, if we're always so deeply concerned about being perfect in these things that we never wade into difficult, contentious conversations, then we will probably continue on the spiral that the church is on right now, where we are losing culture and losing people.
Agree. I thought that was well said on both accounts. I mean, you know me, I think I would disagree a little bit, or maybe a lot of it, with the strong restraint of emotion, you know, in the pulpit.
No, I disagree too.
Meaning I mean, you've seen me, I mean, some of the stuff bothers me so much that I don't have any other word. It just hurts me to the core to think that
completely with you.
the church is being led in so many ways down a path that is going to be so destructive, right? I mean, it breaks my heart. So, you know, you got to trust that perhaps because God is, he made our personality. He's put us together as we are. We are emotional creatures. He emotes, gets angry, weeps. I think there's a place for that, but
I totally disagree with him on that point, by the way.
But I agree. But I do agree with Reed that we are at a time where I guess we're going to be forced, aren't we? I mean, if we say there are things that we believe that will matter. I mean, they matter. And then they'll matter if we get them wrong to others in a profound way. Mm-hmm. That if we just, if we just stay silent on things that are profoundly broken, all under the banner of I was the nice one, I think that's a great error. You know, I think it is a great error, and I think you will make mistakes wading into that territory. I think that there's a certain sense in which, like complaining, you know, the children of Israel, there was a murmur, mm-hmm. and then 2 million people are murmuring is sort of contagious. I think courage can be contagious. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, I hope that in some of the ways that we deal with some things, some folks can look on and say, okay, I'm not going to be afraid to take an appropriate stand in this particular place. But we will get it wrong. I mean, we will get it wrong. I mean, golly, and thank the Lord that, you know, people's souls aren't hanging in the balance because we've got the right words or the right tone or whatever. I mean, my gosh.
That's a big mind-blowing thing, right?
Right.
Jesus saves people regardless of what we, how perfect we are.
That is,
right?
That is, God to be freeing.
God speaks through stupid, is what I like to say.
Always. I mean, there aren't any, always. There's no other vessel available. There was only ever one, right? Christ showed up and he did all things well. Mm-hmm. We essentially do all things unwell. And we're somewhere along the line of perhaps making some sort of progress near the heart of God on particular issues, right? Near his compassion, his truth, and his wisdom and perspective on various things. So I think you navigate both of those tensions very well, and I sense it, myself. So I just add that.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. All right, fellas. Well, we've been at this after a while, and you're late, so we got to let you go. I'll just end with a kind of final story that will underscore why this conversation, ours, but more broadly, the conversation about human sexuality is so important. I can't help but wonder if we're seeing this conversation rise to the fore in especially Christian circles, because one of the predominant ways that you can destroy a culture, destroy a society, is through sexual perversion. Now, I think about the incident of Peor, just to use a biblical example, where Balaam's trying to curse God's people and God won't let him do it, and he tries to curse them multiple times, and all that keeps on coming out of his mouth is blessing for the people of Israel. And then finally he concocts a plan that we hear about in Numbers 31, where he's like, all right, the only way that you can get these people to be cursed is if they start sinning against God, and then God will be against them. So get all these Midianite women naked and throw them into the camp, and then get them to fornicate with these women, and then they'll be worshiping idols in no time. And so that was the plan. And so we see this in Numbers 31, how this plays out, and why Moses issues the destruction of the Midianites. All that to say this, that one of the last resorts of the enemy when he cannot destroy a civilization is he will send from the inside out, he will send sexual perversion. And we're seeing that in full force today in our society, because I believe that Marxists especially know that that is the way to destroy this great nation. I care about it. I care what God is doing through America, around the world, and here. I care about the people that will be impacted by this sexual perversion. I care, as you said, Pastor, about the exponential increase in depression, anxiety, and suicide rates that we're seeing right now that can't inevitably, even if I'm accused of cause correlation, that can't but inevitably be as a result of people experimenting on themselves sexually. All that to say, the consequences for bad ideas are high, and we're seeing them all the time. So that's why it's important that I think we get these things right, that we talk about it effectively, and we get down to the issues as they really matter. So for our part, I hope we've done that, at least in some small way, and that it'll be beneficial to you guys at home. But thank you guys for being a part of this conversation. I can't wait to do it with you next month.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Reed.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and most importantly, go with God.